Good evening, everybody. I'm not sure whether you agree with me. Good evening, everybody. Before the rains come and we all join Noah's Ark. It's nice to have everybody here. Welcome to the Carver Museum here in East Austin, Texas. I'm Larry Schooler from the City of Austin's Communications and Public Information Office. It's a pleasure to be with you all on this very important topic. It's not every day that a panel session has not one, not two, but 3 exclamation points in the title. So this must be a pretty exciting evening that we have in front of us. Best practices in development review, faster, smoother, smarter. Oh my. So we're in for a treat. We have experts here from around the country to discuss this topic with us. As you all know, we are getting underway with a very ambitious process to take another look at our land development code in the wake of the adoption of the Imagine Austin Comprehensive Plan about a year and change ago. We're trying to make sure that the land development code aligns with the goals of Imagine Austin. It's an ambitious effort that's being undertaken by the City of Austin's Planning and Development Review Department with the help of a lot of other departments and especially a lot of help from a community advisory group, several of whose members are here tonight. Would the members of the CAG just quickly raise their hands so folks know that they're there? Thank you all very much for being here, for serving, and for all the time you're investing in the effort. We appreciate it. So I think what I'll do is ask our panelists to briefly introduce themselves to give you a little sense of who they are and where they're coming from. Tonight we're very pleased to have Paul Zucker, LaShondra Holmes, Peter Park, and Mark White joining us tonight, and you may or may not know they'll be also heading up some small group discussions when we complete the panel part of this program. So not only will you have a chance to send questions my way for them during the panel session, but then they will each be leading topical conversations in the adjacent rooms down the hall once we're finished with the panel. So there'll be lots of chances for you to get your questions answered and your topics heard tonight. So without further ado, Paul, please introduce yourself.
Okay. See if that works. Okay. My name is Paul Zucker. I'm a consultant out of San Diego, California. I've got a little strange background. I started as an architect, spent 25 years running planning departments, various parts of the country, and I currently consider myself an organizational management consultant. And we specialize, all we do is look at planning, building, engineering departments. We've now done 170 of these in 31 states, plus some Canadian and Caribbean communities. And my other claim to fame, and I see Jim Duncan back here. Jim, I guess you brought me and another panel in here 26 years ago. And I have the document right here, which I probably will share with the city at some point. I read it on the plane coming out, and I don't know what you're doing today, but I wouldn't be surprised if you got some of the same issues that you had 26 years ago. But so anyway, that's who I am. I'm happy to be here.
Hello, I'm LaShondra Holmes, Stringfellow. I'm planning manager at the City of Dallas. I'm actually sitting in tonight for our director, Teresa O'Donnell. I've been at 3 different cities in the city of Texas. I'm a planner by trade, but the director had the great idea to actually put me in the building inspections department last year to look at some of their processes, and we came up with a couple new things that we got a lot of praise from the development community, and we'll be talking about that in the small group later on.
Hi, everybody. Hello, I'm Peter Park. I'm from Denver. I'm actually one of the sub-consultants on the Land Development Code update with Opticos. And before being a consultant, I was a planning director in Denver, and before then in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And in both cities, I oversaw the rewrite and update of the zoning code and the remapping of the city. So I guess I'm just here to tell you that it's possible to do on a citywide basis, and you can still survive. And I think something must have happened to me because I'm still involved in doing this work, not only here, but also with Mark White and Leanne Swiler from Code Studio from Austin. We're working on the code in Los Angeles. My work is also focused on infrastructure and taking freeways out of cities, for example, to make them better, and planning cities around public transit. So in Denver, we have one of the largest public transit expansion projects in the U.S., expanding light rail and commuter rail and bus rapid transit. So for me, the work has really always been about how do we link the planning vision to the practical reality and implementation. And so when we did the update in the zoning code in both Milwaukee and Denver, that was simultaneous with the reorganization and the consolidation of our permitting system and our permit review processes.
Thank you, Peter. My name is Mark White. I'm not the former governor of Texas. I'm actually a partner in a law firm called White & Smith, LLC, but I'm actually a planner who just knows the law. We specialize in code updates. We've done about 150 code updates and similar projects in 36 different states, including our work with Peter and Lee in Los Angeles. We're working with Lee in Cincinnati. And about a little over a decade ago, we did the Unified Development Ordinance for the city of San Antonio. So I've been around the horn actually here in Texas and am familiar with a lot of the unique issues that you face in this state. We speak a lot at conferences like these around the country, including APA, and I also wrote a model land development code, an annotated one called the 21st Century Land Development Code a few years ago, which is a good resource and I think makes a great gift if you're doing your Christmas shopping. Please keep it in mind. Your kids will never forget you when they're opening their presents. So,
it's interesting what message that gift might send.
Exactly.
Well, thank you all very much. As you can see, we have quite an illustrious and experienced panel here tonight. We appreciate them coming from far and wide. Also want to welcome Councilmember Chris Riley, who's here tonight. He's done a fantastic job providing leadership on a variety of land use issues, and we appreciate you being here as well. Speaking of elected officials, I want to start actually with a question to you all about who decides what, because there are decisions that get made at, say, LaShandra's level of administrative, then there's a planning commission or a board of adjustment or a zoning and plating, and then there is a council, a city council. How do you decide who decides what in the course of a land development code process? And for all these questions, anybody who'd like to chime in may do so. So please.
Sure. I think one of the best practices in any code update like this that we typically begin around the country when you're trying to encourage development that implements your plan and you're trying to make the things that you want to see happen as easy as possible. There's always a push to make as many of those decisions as administrative as possible, to assign as many decisions as you can to the professional staff who understand the plan policies, who understand the criteria that are set out in the development codes. Some of them, rezonings by state law in most states, have to be made by your governing bodies. And one of the balancing acts you're going to face as you go forward is where you draw that line and maybe trying to take back decisions that are currently assigned to your planning commission, to your city council, and as I understand it, a whole host of other agencies around the city that you may or may not want to continue to have, that you may not want to continue in existence, actually, as you go forward. Once you've decided as a community what the criteria ought to be, the best practice that we've seen around the country is to assign that to administrative staff. That's a big challenge, I think, to lay down on your lap as you go forward. But I think if you want development to reflect those plan policies, that's where you should probably begin as much as possible.
Yeah, I would echo that. The more that is by right or administratively handled, the the less time it takes to get development in your city. And, you know, for better or for worse, time is money. And if you care about, how many of you care about affordability in your city? How many of you care about the quality of design in your city? Well, so these are the kind of things that often you lose when development gets costs and the cost of delivering a development goes up. I think the other thing that's important to recognize, I know it's hard to see sometimes, but this opportunity in the updated Land Development Code is a pretty significant one. You know, my experience in Milwaukee and in Denver and talking with other cities, I mean, the main thing is the way of dealing with permitting and zoning, because the old code was not sufficiently delivering the outcome that folks aspired their city to be. All of these different processes evolved over time. More things went to the Board of Zoning Appeals. More things ended up going to the Planning Board. More things went to the City Council. So it became sort of the way that we do business, and it's the way that you understand it. So I think in many ways it's hard, as Mark is mentioning, like we say this, I think, with some caution, recognizing that it may, for some folks, feel like, well, we'll lose control, or we won't get the results that we want. Well, how do we protect our neighborhoods if it's all done administratively? Well, if you had a better code, you can get that. And the question is, you know, if I said to you, how do you explain what chocolate tastes like to someone who's never tasted chocolate? It's really difficult to imagine, but it's quite possible to do. And by all of the complexities that are in the code today, there's a lot of lessons learned, because there are things that are delivering the things that you want. It's just that it's kind of all over the place.
At the City of Dallas, we have definitely some of those same complexities in terms of our code. It's been very important to try to empower our staff to be able to make those decisions, just because there's no way that the managers have the time to answer every question. So we've let the staff know that it's okay to make a mistake every now and then, as long as you're making that mistake with the best information that you have at hand. And we've actually seen a lot of good results. I think staff morale is up, as well as applicants are happy that they don't have to wait 2 weeks to get to a manager, because staff is now able to make a lot of those calls where they really already had the information, but they just kind of wanted someone to tell them, yes, you're making the right decision.
Just as a rule of thumb, and usually people in an audience like this don't like to hear it, but we push everything as far down in the organization as possible. City Council is now making a decision. We try to push it to Planning Commission. The Planning Commission is making a decision. We try to push it administratively. And the other thing I've heard here, I used to think it was only New England, but I've heard it's places like Austin too. When I do work in New England, I mean, they'll have 6 or 7 or 8 different commissions, all sort of dealing with the pieces of it. And I'm told here that's an issue. So if we were looking at it, we would try to consolidate some of those also. And then the other model being used, particularly in places like Oregon and Washington, is what's called the professional hearing officer. So they're sort of the equivalent of the planning commission, but they are professionals specifically hired for that purpose. Now, having said all this, if your policies are not clear, if your comp plan's not clear, then you don't want to turn it over to staff. Then you go back to the more traditional political approach. But if you want consistency and you want shorter timelines, our experience is you can get it by this kind of delegation process.
So then where do you all see planning commissions and elected officials in the future as it relates to some of these decisions? Given the efficiency gained by shifting more to administrative, where does a group like a planning commission or city council come in?
The city council is a legislative body. The planning commission assists the city council in making planning-based decisions. Legislative bodies should make legislative decisions. Legislative bodies should not make administrative decisions whenever you can avoid that. Now, there's some, state law assigns some plat approval authority to the Planning Commission, so you may be stuck with some of that. But to the extent that you can, decisions that don't have to be made at a discretionary level should not be made at a discretionary level. And that all gets to how good a job you're able to do over these next couple of years or so, defining and agreeing upon as a community what the criteria for new development ought to be. Once you've made that decision as a community and decided what you want new development to be, what you want it to look like, what the uses ought to be, how sites should be designed, and you've defined that clearly in the code, there's no reason even for a planning commission, if you can get away with it, to be involved in that type of decision. They should only be involved in things that truly ought to be discretionary. There should be a short list of uses maybe, things like landfills, really intensive uses. But those should be the exception, not the rule.
Well, the norm around the country that we see is a high percent of planning commissions aren't doing any planning. They're processing permits of some type. And so we see places, we've actually seen some places, and I don't know if this is possible in Texas, where the city council has pulled themselves totally out of the approval process. The only thing they're dealing with is the new zoning code and the comp plan. And then we also have seen places where the planning commission has done the same thing, said we will do planning. That's our goal, is planning. But the development goes to staff level or hearing officers or some other model.
So there may be, for some folks in the audience, a little bit of a distinction between who's making the decision and how might someone appeal a decision made by either an administrator or an elected body. So for you all, in your experience, where do appeals come in? Who gets to appeal? How do appeals get best addressed, even if they're decided by administrative officials?
So, well, before we get to the who, right, I mean, I think part of it is understanding what's the nature of the appeal. One of the primary drivers of what was the impetus for the zoning code update in Milwaukee was most development had to go through a special use or a variance process. And then you look at that and you say, well, if 99% of the time these things are approved, why do we put things through that additional process? Why don't we learn from what are the conditions that are successful, that are making these projects successful, and codify that? And that becomes the rule rather than the exception that required this additional process, right? So I mean, it's important to think about, well, what are the things that are going for an exceptional kind of process now? Because if the development that we want is going through the additional process and the development that we don't want doesn't, we're kind of upside down in the way our regulations are organized today. And so, and that goes to the substance of what's actually in the code.
Right, and under state law, and Texas has pretty much the same enabling legislation we have in Missouri, where I live, the old Standard Zoning Enabling Act. They create this body called the Board of Zoning Adjustment. And when you set up administrative processes, people have due process rights. Certainly the applicant does. State law will define who has standing to appeal something that affects them. And the body that usually sorts out those appeals is the Board of Zoning Adjustment. As Paul mentioned, some states created a professional level zoning hearing examiner or hearing officer that usually has a little bit more expertise, sometimes a lot more continuity than a Board of Zoning Adjustment. Some of that's dictated by state law, as Peter mentioned. Some of that can be resolved by getting your standards right and not having to have so many requests for variances. Some of it can be resolved through alternative standards, maybe that are, dealt with administratively by the zoning administrator. You can do one standard or another, and it's not a question of varying the standard. It's a question of which standards you apply. The irony is, ideally, the Board of Zoning Adjustment is something that, if you do your job right, you'll rarely be using. They won't have to meet monthly. On the other hand, if they don't meet monthly, they're going to lose their expertise over time. So that's why I think in some places a professional hearing examiner or hearing officer, if your charter allows you to do that, is a good approach to think about.
Just maybe one last thing from my point of view on appeals. I like what we deal with what we call national best practices, and but then we say we could bring all those into Austin, but some of them won't work in Austin. So every place we go, we have to look at the local community and weigh that local community against national best practices. From a national best practice perspective, you do have to have appeals, but we like to limit to one level. It's not unusual in a community. You go 2, 3 levels of appeal, and the process goes on forever. So if you can collapse all this thing, it's going to work better, we think.
By level, you mean planning commission and stop, or council and stop?
Right.
As sort of a corollary to that, there's the notion of giving folks standing to appeal, but then there's also the challenge of making folks aware of pending development applications that either might be decided administratively or otherwise. I'm particularly interested, Lashandra, in your situation. I mean, it's a massive city. What are some best practices around letting residents or other stakeholders know about proposals? Are all proposals kind of treated equally in terms of notification? Who gets notified about what and how?
Right. Other than our State Enabling Act, which requires certain replats and zoning and SUPs to be notified, we also notify on
SUP.
I'm sorry, thank you. Special use permits. We also notify on certain types of administrative plans, and those administrative plans are what we consider development plans that have to be approved. Development plans are typically larger developments that are in conjunction with what's called a planned unit development. So whenever someone comes in and they say, okay, I have my zoning, now I'm bringing in this development plan to show you how I'm going to comply with the PUD, then we actually notify residents within 300 feet of that property. And at that time, if we get a certain amount of resistance, then we'll go ahead and schedule it for a Planning and Zoning Commission meeting.
And is notification by mail?
Yes, the notification is by mail.
Gotcha. What else have you all seen in other communities?
Well, there's 2 questions here, and one of them, I know in the handout, was should all permits be treated equally? And the answer to that is no. All permits should not be treated equally. All processes that shouldn't be treated equally. The notice you're going to get as a community for by right, what we've been calling by right, or development that is entitled to administrative approval, as a community is what you're going to do over these next couple years. You're going to come together as a community and agree on what the standards for new development in your community, in your neighborhood ought to be. And, the community needs to participate in that process. That's their notification. When a building permit complies with those standards, when a certificate of zoning compliance complies with those standards, the neighborhood doesn't need the formal notice that they used to get, for example, in a rezoning, because you've already agreed on what those standards are. Your professional staff has reviewed the application and determined that that permit complies with the standards we as a community agree ought to apply to new development. It's only those discretionary type decisions that should get noticed. So that's the question of what types of processes carry public notice with them. Sometimes that's controversial, and that's one of those big issues you're going to have to come to grips with as you update the code. And it's a hard thing sometimes for neighborhoods to let go of because they want to know about everything. Paul's probably going to talk a little bit about technology. With modern technology, you can put every application online and people can look it up and know that it's going on. They just won't get a letter in the mail or an email or blast or something like that somebody's pulling a building permit. And that would, if your objective is to streamline development approval, that's something you absolutely don't want to do. So that's who gets notice, and then there's what kind of notice. State law mandates things like mail and notification for certain types of things. A more modern code uses technology and uses internet, email, et cetera. You don't have to codify that, and I wouldn't codify it because state law doesn't require it. I'd just do it. And a lot of modern codes also have a table that will tell you, for each process, who makes the decision, what kind of process is it? Is it legislative? Is it administrative? Is there a public hearing? And is there notice? And if so, how is notice given? That's going to be done ideally, I think, in this code when it's done over the next couple years. But, all processes aren't the same.
I think we need to be a little careful here because listening to our panel, it's sounding like we so-called professionals know what's good for the rest of you. I always thought that when I was a young planner. All you had to do is follow my value structure, and it all worked well. So that's really not where I come from. The community does need to decide who should get notice and sort it out, and I think that's what Mark's saying. Now, however, let's say you've decided we do want to do notice. Well, today we've got all the internet available. We've got all the social media. I would use all of those things. And then forget the newspaper. I mean, the newspapers are useless. And forget the state statute that says 15 days before blah, 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 which is typical. We talk about early notice. So if you really want citizen participation, which you seem to want in this community, you got over 300 recognized citizen groups here, and they've only grown by a few since I was here, 26 years ago I said I was here, and I think the groups are pretty much the same. So you do want citizen participation, but let's give you early notice, because we want to shorten the process for the developer. Now, why do we want to do that? I think Peter said time is money, but there's something else, because time is money with the developer. The quality of project approvals will actually go down as your timelines go up, because somebody's got to pay for that time. So from the developer's point of view, we want short timelines. From your point of view, those of you that are the citizens in the room, you probably want longer timelines. And so we try to accommodate that in the system, but one way we do it is to give you early notice. The sooner we can give you notice, the better.
What does that typically mean? What is early?
I would say the day that application walks in the office, you get notice. In some communities, we require the developer to meet with the citizens actually submitting the application. So that gives you, we're trying to get both sides of this working better.
And I'd also like to add on the early notification. In the last city I was in, we did exactly that. We required the developer to meet, that was in League City, we required the developer to meet with the residents that were in that notification area prior to submitting the application. It worked beautifully, because by the time the city actually sent the notification, then it wasn't like the city was trying to take their property. They knew all the ins and outs and the details of that application. The other thing that we do in Dallas is we do early notification, but we do early notification to neighborhood groups. So those neighborhood groups register with us, and we send it out if you're in a 1,000-foot radius.
I have to ask, though, as a public participation professional, I mean, when you say that you require a developer to sit down with that neighborhood group, I mean, that could take a lot of different forms. That could just be, hey, I'm here for 10 minutes and, here's my plan. Or that could be, I'm going to spend an hour and a half and we're really going to, hash through it and give you all some say. What kind of templates were there?
We did not get into the details of how they met, but they did have to submit to us a log of everyone who attended that meeting. And they had to give us a notarized letter saying that they did hold a meeting.
Well, we like to do one other thing that a lot of cities do not want, and the staff does not want. We want staff at those meetings also. We don't want just the developer there, because this is the way we view development, and I wish I had my overhead here to put on the wall. We see growing a city as a dance, and it's three people holding hands. And who are those three people? One's the applicant, one's the city's bureaucracy, and one's you in this room, the broad citizens. And together, that's the way you build a city. And so it's not like us versus them, it's together. And as I said earlier today in one of our meetings, I did this work in Scottsdale, Arizona. Finally, the citizens in one of these meetings like this said, and when the project, we break ground, we stand hand in hand around the project singing Kumbaya. And I said, that's exactly the goal that I envisioned for your process.
We could practice now if you...
Yes.
We started to talk about technology in that last answer, so I'm curious about either emerging or existing technologies you all are seeing around the country that benefit an approval process, whether it be notification or otherwise. What are you seeing that you think is useful?
What? Sure, go ahead.
Well, this is a major shift taking place, and we've done a lot of research on this, trying to find all the cities in Canada and the U.S., what they're doing with technology. Putting it in shorthand, we are now finally at the point where we can do the paperless office. And from what I've told about Austin so far, I'm a little surprised because I think you're a progressive community, but I can tell you you're way behind the time. So electronic plans, getting rid of all the paper plans, everything comes in over the internet, you pay your credit card over the internet, all the plans are distributed. You know, if you've got how many, 30, 40, 60 different review places in this town, you all see the plans at the same time. And some of them are right on the internet. You might even put them up for a blog on the internet so that people start commenting on the plans right there on the internet. So that's where it's at. And I'm glad to see we have a councilman here because here's what we're seeing. I know this is still a place that wants to grow and economic development. We're seeing national chains starting to say, we don't want to deal with your community if you don't have electronic plan check. I was talking to somebody in the beforehand here who, I don't know, a developer or an architect saying, well, one of their staff was in Cayman Islands and one was somewhere else. And that's the way things work these days. It's not like we go down the street here and everybody's in the same office. So electronic plan check, not only do we save the forest in doing this, we save time, we make it easier for everybody to participate. So that's where it's coming. So I would push, if I were you all, I'd try to push this city along a little bit in that arena. And we have places that are, one of my big clients is the Calgary. Calgary is going totally paperless in their processes.
This is not necessarily development review, but the update of the Land Development Code is a pretty heavy lift. I mean, it's a pretty ambitious thing to take on. And I can just tell you that, in my experience, without what we're able to do with GIS, Geographic Information System, mapping, the kind of updating of codes and the mapping update particularly, I don't think, quite frankly, would have been possible in a very effective way before we had this much information and data to work from to study what existing land uses, what existing zoning, and all of the other additional layers that might be, applicable to a piece of property, what that looks like. Because when it was all paper, to figure that out was just reason enough for a city not to take on trying to update the code, right? But you've got an awesome GIS section here and capacities. So at least in moving toward that goal of updating the Land Development Code, I think I can't imagine doing it, of a city of this area and this scale without the kind of technology capacities that you have.
And this is a good time to do it also. If you're changing that internal process, it's a good time to do it and to put it in place while you're updating your code. That's what happened in San Antonio 10 years ago. They instituted their one-stop shop, which I notice you have here as well, at the same time that they did the Unified Development Ordinance update. They sort of went hand in hand. They were separate processes, but they both came online at the same time. There are all kinds of permit tracking software technologies out there. I frankly don't know which is better. It's worth looking into. But I can tell you two of the advantages of them, of having that kind of thing in place, are, first of all the departments have the same information. The engineers have the same information that the planners have. They can all coordinate more effectively in processing applications, and the public has the same information as well. They have very quick access to information, and like Paul said, this is the 21st century. There's no excuse for continuing to cut down trees to process applications. We've got the technology. Let's use it.
Right.
It also keeps people honest.
Yeah.
I remember there was a time when, right? I mean, if you ask any developer in any city how the city permitting process is, they'll have plenty of recommendations for you, right, and comments. And I recall a time when the mayor said to me, "Oh, I saw so-and-so at some event, and he said, you know, the staff is holding up the project, and what's going on?" I said, "Okay, I'll check it out." And so the developer, well, I checked out with my staff. The staff said, "Oh, yeah, we have that project," but they haven't submitted their drawings yet. Okay? So the consultants basically told their client, because the city, when you work for the city, you got a big target on your back. It's an easy one to blame. And so I said, "Oh, that's good to know. So when are we going to get the drawings, do you think?" Well, they said maybe in a couple of weeks. I said, "Okay." So I went back to the mayor, and I told him, and he called the developer right away, and the developer was completely embarrassed, but he had misinformation, right? It was just easy for the consultants to just throw the city staff under the bus to explain why they were actually not getting their work done. So it does keep people honest when you actually have the ability to look at it.
It's a bit of a hobby in Austin to throw city staff under the proverbial bus.
Well, there's one other piece to this. We're kind of drifting into the development process, but you're about to launch this big code, and this is not my level of expertise, but what some people are now calling electronic codes. So in my simplified way as a non-code expert, the way I envision it is this. All I want to do is put a little room addition onto my house. Now, I don't want you to hand me 300-page code. We ought to be able to write the code from what I call artificial intelligence, where I can push a button and say, this is the piece of the code that you need to look at. That's all you need. However you do it, and I don't know what you're planning to do here, but hopefully your consultants will at least dip their toe into this electronic part of the code to make it easier. Because even after it's simplified, it's still tough, I think.
We've been talking a little bit about ways to use technology to streamline and expedite a process. There's also been some talk in this community, and I think in others, around having applicants essentially pay for an expedited process. A, is this something that you're actually seeing in other communities, and or B, what are your thoughts on enabling applicants to pay for expedited processing of applications?
Okay, I'll start that one out. At the City of Dallas, we have what's called a Q-Team review, and there were lots of people who were against the idea of people being allowed to basically come in and pay $1,000 an hour, because that is the fee, to jump ahead of other mom and pop shops who maybe couldn't afford that fee. And the reason why we decided to go ahead and do that is because we are working on our digital plan review process. However, that process is not here yet. And we needed a way to allow someone who is building a 10-story structure to be able to talk to all the different departments at one time. So what that fee allows us to do is hire staff who only works on certain projects who are part of this Q team review. So it's worked brilliantly for us, and I definitely would encourage anybody to definitely look at it, as opposed to, you know, automatically throwing out the idea that we shouldn't do it because it's not fair to everybody.
So that interdepartmental team is utilized only in the case of that additional fee?
That is correct. That team only works on projects that pay that fee.
Because there is a question from the audience, for the other panelists, there is a question from the audience related to cities where staff from various departments meet to review applications. And so it's like they do in Dallas in certain cases.
That is correct, in those cases only.
And I'm wondering if you all see that as well as the expedited.
Well, having interdepartment review is a common theme in almost every city and county that we work with. The problem is how well that joint review works, and whether the applicant actually gets valuable information or if it's just kind of a routine. So we could spend a lot of time just on that, but having that process is clearly needed, and of course electronic plan review helps you in that quite a bit. I'm a big fan of expedited. The more screwed up your processes are, the more it calls for expedited processes. However, the complaint is it puts everybody else, you know, the rich people move ahead and the rest of us are behind. But you don't have to do it that way, and it almost sounds like Dallas has got this figured out. And so I'll give you an example. The city of Los Angeles is having a terrible time with their subdivision process. It just took you forever to get a subdivision. So this is what they put together, an expedited process. It said basically you will pay your normal subdivision fee. You will also pay every single person that touches your subdivision. You'll pay that fee. So you're paying double, maybe triple your normal fee. And we will get your subdivision through here in 45 days. Now, so they didn't set everybody else back. They got 60 new positions authorized that the city manager could release once the workload came in for that expedited. Now, what do you think's happening in LA? Every subdivision is now expedited, because you can knock 2, 3, 4 months out of a subdivision process. That's a lot of money. So the development community is more than willing to pay those fees, and you're not setting everybody else back in the process.
Yeah, I think if you do expedited, you definitely have to create a structure like they're describing, such that all others don't get delayed, right? That's not good government. That's just unfair. I think the other part of it is it's a bit of a challenge to manage this, because sometimes folks think we're part of the elite team and the rest of you you do the slow stuff like you've always done. So internally, culturally, it's a challenge to manage it sometimes. So I think a significant part of this is that if it's physically possible to do a review within a shorter time than is normal, that means it's possible to do. So rather than saying the only way we do that is expedited, that should become the place that you learn how to do it, so everybody does it that way, right? So it's sort of thinking about it in terms of it's a pilot, or however you want to describe it. If it helps you generate more funds to invest in your technology, that's great, but I wouldn't look at it as a way of long-term we're going to have these kind of two type of reviews, because you'll never raise up the level of service. You'll never drive the kind of improvement through the whole organization.
I have a question in my notes that I want to preface with a plea from an audience member. It says, going through the development and permitting process is painful and medieval. That sounds kind of fun, actually, to the point that we are all now expected to have lawyers and expediters to get anything approved. The system is broken. We all as a community cannot afford this complex system. Please help. Panel, you're being asked to help.
Well, what's wrong with lawyers making money? That's what I want to know.
Well, I think that, so the add-on to that is a question I have here around, as this community goes through this process of taking a good hard look at its development review system, what steps should this community take in analyzing it, and how should it best identify the potential improvements? I think you've started to answer it in some of your other answers, but how do we give this person the help that this person wants?
Exactly. Well, and that gets to the process of developing the code as opposed to the process of processing applications. There's a number of steps you need to take. One is to interview people who go through the process constantly, the power users of the code, your applicants, people who you see filing for subdivision plats, home builders, developers in your urban areas, your downtown, developers in your suburban locations. They will tell you about different experiences they see in their application process, and neighborhood activists, whoever tends to involve themselves highly in the development approval process. The power users, what we sometimes call the code junkies, you need to talk to, because they're the people who probably have the most familiarity off the top of their head about what works and what doesn't. Couple that with your public outreach process as you're going forward. The public needs to understand the changes that are being made. If we make the changes we were talking about at the beginning of the presentation, where ideally you're making more things administratively because you've agreed as a community on what your plan policies are. Now we've agreed on what the standards are. The community needs to understand now how the process is going to work and how it's going to change, because it's always true whenever we update a code that there's two things everybody hates. Everybody hates their existing development code, and then everybody hates anything that changes their existing development code. So be mindful of that as you go forward. People need to understand what those changes are. So it's an outreach process, both from your consultant who's working on this, from staff members. We use focus groups a lot. I like to get developers in a room and by themselves so they can vent. Neighborhood groups in the room by themselves, so they can, what he said or what she said, and they're empowered to talk. They don't have to stand in front of a large group of people and argue. And then at some point, you've got to have, you'll probably have a committee process where you get good, reasonable people from both sides talking to each other, making compromises, and then talking to the people in their community about, what the changes are and why they work best for the city of Austin.
I thought it was an interesting question. You have three consultants sitting up here to ask that question, because we could all answer it the same way. We'll leave our business cards as we leave the meeting. There's a related issue that didn't come up at all in our earlier discussions today, and I haven't gotten enough feedback to staff, but this is what we see nationally. Whether you're properly staffed to carry out these functions or not. And if you're understaffed, then everything we're talking about, you might as well forget it, because it's not going to happen. And there's no reason you should be understaffed here. Almost every community we work with is full cost recovery in these processes. They have big reserve accounts when the development takes a dip, and so they need to be fully staffed. And the interesting thing that's happened, during the heyday, when development was high, we actually went into Fort Worth, and the chamber passed the hat and brought us in. Koch brothers put some money in, and other people like that. And we were only in there one day, and I said, the issue here is very clear. You're totally understaffed. I mean, there was no way. We could set up all the processes, wasn't going to work till they staffed up. And they did staff up. Now what's happened in many cities, and I'm not so certain about Austin, but when cities have gone through the recession, staffs were cut, there were layoffs, and now development is picking up again. We're seeing it all over the country. And what we're now seeing is even though they were overstaffed for a while, now they're understaffed again. And so I don't know what the situation is here, but if you don't have the right staff in place, you're not going to deal with these issues.
Just before Peter weighs in, I mean, are there metrics to use to calibrate what fully
absolutely,
staffed is?
sure.
And what's a thumbnail sketch of how someone...
Well, the metric is really you decide what your process should look like. And if you can't meet that process, then you got to change your staffing. Add staff, the quality of the staff, what have you. So there are metrics. And we're dealing, it's easier, the metrics are easier on building and engineering than they are in planning. Mm-hmm. But we have rule of thumb metrics that how long should it take you to look at a single-family house that comes in? I don't know what that time is. Maybe we have a staff member that can tell us, but maybe not. Okay. What? Days? I mean, that's outrageous. I mean, if that's true, that is totally outrageous. And what should it be? I mean, I would probably say it should be a week or two, but even here, if you got it down to 30, 60 days, you'd have a big change, right? But I mean, I can't believe, city councilman, I can't believe that the elected officials can survive in this community with those kind of... I'm kind of being indelicate here, but I mean, that's... You brought us in to give us what advice we could.
Just for the record, we don't have confirmation on the data that was just presented.
Well, you know...
We are on Channel 6. I just want to make it clear we're not...
Yeah. You know, the staffing level, obviously, right? You have to have the right capacity to deal with the demand of work, of applications coming in. How the work is organized has a lot to do with what's actually in the code, right? So, for example, I mean, there's a big difference on how review is done. I can just tell you, for example, in Milwaukee, a high-rise building, the person who reviews the zoning and the building code compliance is one person on city staff, right? How could one person know that much information to review the plan? In Denver, it would take about 7 different people at least, just within the planning department that I had, to do the same review. How can it be that these tasks have been broken down into so many different parts? Is gravity different in Milwaukee than Denver? Is the nature of material strength different in one city from the next? No. I mean, part of it is the people who submit the drawings, they're licensed professionals. They stamp drawings. They pay liability insurance. Their livelihood depends on them doing good things. I mean, I'm just saying, sometimes when we have review on the public side that is broken down into a lot of different pieces, we essentially provide a free red line service for consultants. It's an interesting phenomenon that goes on. So that sometimes consultants just submit, because they know that somebody's going to be marking it up no matter what they do, and it's going to go through all these different channels. So, I mean, I'm just saying, I've actually done some research in comparing public and private buildings, and this is one of the findings in terms of when you break apart the responsibilities of the review. So, for example, in Denver, it used to be for a single-family or two-family residential permit, you needed to go to zoning, and there was a whole zoning staff that reviewed compliance with zoning. And then there was a different staff that reviewed compliance for single two-family, pretty simple construction for compliance with the building code. And there were 2 different staff, 2 different groups, 2 different managers, 2 different level positions, right? And we said, well, you know, an architect actually needs to know the zoning code and the building code to design the building. That's one person. Can't government have one person review and determine compliance? So we actually use that as a way to cross-train. And the classifications of those positions were different. So it gave us a chance to combine the staff, give people promotional opportunities, and actually create a deeper bench in terms of the capacity of the city. Because what was going on in heavy times is the zoning staff were getting their stuff done, the building code staff were not getting their stuff done. We were sending it to LA for compliance with the building code for single-family residential, right? So when we increase the capacity by an organizational improvement and increasing staff, individual capacities for what they can provide in terms of service, you have much more capacity and horsepower to deliver.
That leads me to touch on one last sort of theme from the questions that were prepared in advance, and then I'm going to try to get to all of the remaining audience questions. But there's some questions here around how do you rationalize the different roles that staff play in a process? How do you promote consistency of staff interpretation? How do you foster an environment in which staff looks beyond their individual area of expertise to understand broader review and permitting issues? Peter's last answer certainly kind of spoke to that. But I mean, we've talked a lot about the significant role and perhaps the increasing significance that staff could play, but how do you decide which staff does what? And how do you ensure that those staff members across a large organization consistently make decisions, in similar ways?
What we've done in Dallas is we had to look at how our department was functioning in terms of what we were wanting to provide for our citizens, but then also what we needed to provide to our customers. So we totally revamped everything for the most part, and we did it by function. So we have, for example, a residential team review. For us, it takes 50 minutes to review one plan. Now, you may have to wait a couple hours to get that review, unless you're a Gold Court member, and I can talk about that a little bit later. But also, another thing that we have done is we had like probably a 3-ring notebook of about 1,000 pages of interpretations. So we've compiled those into 2 pages, front and back, so total 4 pages, so that staff has basically what we call building officials determination guide. They have like a cheat sheet to figure out, okay, how is it that I need to interpret parking for this particular item? Where is it that I need to make sure that there are two ingress and egress for 30 lots or more? So we've tried to do our best to basically make it concise so that staff is being consistent, but we've made it easier for them to be consistent by putting it on a 4-page document, basically.
Yeah, and this gets to, one of the other themes too, which is updating your code, is having the code organized well. The code has to create very clear lines of authority for staff, for commissions, whoever makes a decision on an application, whoever that is. And I'm not familiar enough with the city of Austin's unique situation to tell you, which staff, which department is best suited to make which kind of decision. But I can tell you the code has to be very clear about who makes the decision, how they make the decision, and what that decision authorizes the applicant or allows the applicant to do. So a good code is something that will create, will consolidate those processes, typically in a chapter. We did this in San Antonio over a decade ago. Their processes were scattered all throughout their zoning ordinance and their unified development ordinance. We put them all in one place so people know soup to nuts, beginning to end, how they get their projects entitled. There was a common workflow for each process, so we told applicants, each section says, okay, what situations does this process apply to? How do I get it started? What information do I need to provide? And by the way, that information was in an appendix. It didn't junk up the rest of the ordinance. There's nothing more frustrating than reading a piece of a development code, like a hillside ordinance, for example. And half the stuff in there is the technical information that the applicant has to submit. There's only 2 people in this entire city who care about that. One is the applicant's project engineer, and the other is the person sitting behind the permit counter. But there's got to be a place for that. So we put that all aside in an appendix. You got to say how the decision is made, whether it's a public hearing, whether it's administrative or legislative. You got to, and then you got to say what that gives the applicant the right to do, whether that's to go on to the next step of the process, or whether that's to start construction, whether that's to apply for a building permit, and then how you keep track of the decision that was made. All of those processes should follow a common workflow so that your staff knows where to find the information, right, or somebody who's going through the process knows where to find the information and how to read your processes and understand them.
We have an audience question related to whether you all have seen process maps online and any software that's utilized to depict a process in a user-friendly way. It's okay if you haven't, but...
Well, we use a program. I do a lot of flow charting in a program called SmartDraw for my codes. I find the ones, we do a lot of our codes in Word, and I know Lee and some others do theirs in InDesign and maybe some more up-to-date programs. I find Word's flowcharts to be very limited, and it's hard to map out a process in a way that's visually impactful and easily understandable by whether both a power user and a casual user of the code. And that program for me works pretty well. I don't know if there's others that do a better job, but certainly it's given us the ability to map out processes in a way that are both comprehensive but not so comprehensive that they're just impossible to read.
I think there are two challenges to it. It's I mean, there's the capacity and of the software to be able to do that for you, and there are many. The question of the picture, whether the picture that you get is understandable, may not be a function of the complexity of the software. It may be the nature of the thing that you're diagramming, right? That is, these processes can get really complicated, but like you should be able to map it because it happens every day. I mean, somehow it gets done. This work gets done. And I do find that in working through some of the reorganizations that I've been part of, how much of a challenge it is to draw the picture of how people do the work that they do. I mean, they do it every day. They train people. New people learn it somehow. But we have such a hard time diagramming it. But we have to do it to understand how we're going to make that improvement. And, related to this, it's sort of related to your other question on the staffing. In both the case of Milwaukee and Denver, we went through this reorganization, but we also came to the conclusion that the physical space that became the development center, the sort of needed to be one that was clearly about bringing the staff who were involved in the development review together in a place, right? Not this kind of rabbit warren of places that you just can't figure out where anybody is, because it's hard for staff to work together that way. But I think more significantly, it's hard for the city to project an image that we're open for business, right? And the thing about the code is that the analogy I always use, it's a little bit like hardware and software for computers. Like the code is sort of like your software, and the hardware are your people and your organization. And so we can upgrade the software, but there are just certain times, like if you use OS 10 on the very first Macintosh, like I don't even think you can load it. Okay, I mean Austin, Dell. So imagine the Dell, what is it, the 386, like that, and try to plug in Windows 8 onto that, right? Is it gonna work? Probably not so well. So there is a commensurate sort of level of attention and understanding that upgrade in the software, that upgrade in the code, and the delivery system that you have available to maximize the performance from the result of the new code.
Guys, I have a very short time, and I do want to respect the fact that folks ask some questions, so if you all can try to answer these sort of in speed round fashion. There's a question about the challenge of low community engagement. the participants that this person sees involved are not reflective of city demographics, and even some neighborhood groups they believe aren't diverse. So I guess the question is, how does the city potentially catalyze community involvement from a diverse array of stakeholders when it comes to a development process when the public needs to be involved? How does the city do that? Any thoughts?
Well, it depends on the communities. I mean, different types of communities need different outreach. I mentioned earlier, we find that with home builders and other power users, they're easy to bring to the table. There are other parts of the community where you may have to go to them. I mean, you may have to contact churches, you may have to contact social service organizations and others. You need to find the places where the people in that community interact, and you need to reach out to them. They're not going to come to you.
Bottom line, if you feel there are groups that are not well represented, how do you get to them? I mean, we did a low-income Indian community not too long ago, and we went to them door to door in the living room. So you decide. We can't do that, in this forum. But what Mark is saying is, I'm saying the exact same thing. You figure out what are they. If they're not participating, then whatever you're doing is not working. So you try something else.
I rarely ask yes or no questions, but this question is: should a city enforce deed restrictions?
Well, we all can answer that, right?
No.
Moving on. It was a yes or no question. There's also a question here. Austin has some complicated areas of code that even staff doesn't quite understand. How does a builder move forward without ending up in court? Who at the city can make determinations when the code is so complicated? This panel is not necessarily very well versed in the city of Austin's code, but I don't know, are there cases where they're very difficult to decipher parts of the code in Dallas, and how do you deal with that?
Yes. In Dallas, we have about 17 conservation districts, and we're about to add 3 more. And these conservation districts are primarily residential neighborhoods. And a lot of these conservation districts were actually written by the neighborhoods. So you have neighborhoods who they're saying, well, hey, I wrote this. I know what I meant to say, but unfortunately, it doesn't say that. So we've had 2 different interpretations that have had to go to the Board of Adjustments because the neighborhood believed that they understood that maybe the code didn't say it, but because they wrote it, they interpreted one way, and we as staff said, we're going to try our best to make sure that this new house does not do anything to denigrate your neighborhood. However, we can only go by what the code says. The Board of Adjustment upheld us both times, but it was not very comfortable, particularly now that one of those applicants is now one of our council members. But needless to say, I think that now that person being a council person, he understands and respects the process, and also understands that we have to be as open and as transparent as we possibly can when dealing with the code.
There's a question about our neighborhood planning process. Speaking of neighborhoods, Austin has neighborhood plans that can vary from area to area, which can make prior knowledge for a property owner exceedingly difficult. How can that be codified going forward? That's the question from the audience.
That's an interesting issue to deal with. We're dealing in Los Angeles, where in California they have this thing called a specific plan that has both plans and standards in them, and it's tantamount to having 30 different development codes on top of their already gargantuan development code. What I always caution is plans should be plans. Plans should not be codes. And if your plans are written with the specificity of a development code, that's a real problem, especially if one of your objectives in this process is to streamline development approval. Make sure plan policies read like plan policies. And if they do, they're serving their purpose. If they don't, they're pretending to be development codes when in fact they should just be policy. the standards development is held to should be reflected in the development code, not in your neighborhood plans.
I think that this is almost, this is always a big challenge, because when we do neighborhood plans, small area plans, folks in those local areas are very invested in their plan, right? And their expectation is, well, we did this plan, we spent all this time, we committed our time, we would expect the development that happens here would be consistent with our plan. So the typical mechanism that the zoning solution derives is either creating new zone districts or overlays or something like that, that sort of expands the complexity of the code. I think what the best practice is understanding, well, we need a broader menu in the zoning code. The problem is you have sort of 3 flavors in your zoning code. You actually need a wider bandwidth. It's like the paint, you go to the paint center, you see all these colors, right? It's not just the primary colors, it's just not primary and secondary, tertiary colors. There's a wide bandwidth in the color scheme. So when you do the plans, when you have recommendations in the plans, you actually have the ability to take an off-the-shelf zone district and say, yeah, that will accomplish those goals for the main street in our neighborhood. That will accomplish the goals for the single-family, two-family residential area, the small lot areas in our neighborhood. You don't have that much bandwidth in the code now, and so you add a lot of layers that creates this sort of uncertainty and complexity. So our goal is to learn from what is embedded in those plans and what you already have in the code. Much of your new code is actually written. It's just scattered all over the floor, right? And our job, we're not here to, when we do the code, we're not going to completely reinvent everything. We're going to carry forward the things that make sense and line up with the plan so that we don't lose. In fact, we strengthen the intention of the plan being able to get implemented.
So I am at my time. I want to make sure that the folks who asked a question that didn't get it asked know that they can still approach our panelists in just a moment. But Mark White, Peter Park, Lashandra Holmes, and Paul Zucker, thank you all very much for all this expertise.
Thank you.
So
your judge and jury, gonna leave it to a higher power. Now if you can't let me in to